we're going to look at immigration in the United States and talk about the time period. In the late 19th century, America undergoes some population changes. Large-scale immigration will cause the U.S. population to triple from the American Civil War to the early 1900s to the beginning of the 20th century. And so we're going to look at the causes and effects of immigration, and then we'll go into urbanization and the growth of cities. But beginning with immigration. Millions of immigrants enter the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. Where are they coming from, and why are they coming? So the largest population of immigrants that come to the United States come from Europe. Now, up until 1890, most of these immigrants that were coming into the United States came from northern and western European countries like Britain and Germany, and this really didn't respond with like any sort of dissent or outcry. No one was really critical. There weren't large groups of people who were critical of immigrants coming in from western and northern parts of Europe. And like that Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, old Puritan mentality, those are quote-unquote more desirable immigrants. But then in the 1890s, we see a change in the type of immigrant coming in from Europe. Immigrants coming from Europe starting in the 1890s in very large numbers. I'm talking about millions, some 10, 20 million immigrants per year are coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. They're coming from Slavic regions. They're coming from Poland. They're coming from Italy. They're coming from those farther, those Mediterranean countries of Italy and the Slavic nations. And those people are often considered less desirable. They're more likely to be Jewish. They're more likely to be not Christian. Even they're more likely to be Catholic Christian, and Irish are considered a part of that undesirable immigrant population as well. So what are the reasons that people are coming from Europe? The Industrial Revolution in Europe had caused a shift in the type of labor that people were involved in. People were trying to get industrial jobs. Agriculture was declining. The profits in agriculture were declining. Because of increased population, there was less farmland available for people to farm, and then industrial jobs were few. So many Europeans came to the United States for job opportunities. And then some came to flee persecution. There was a government-sanctioned persecution of Jews in Russia, government-sanctioned persecution of Jews in the Slavic region and Eastern Europe. So many people were fleeing religious persecution. There were also some autocratic, really oppressive governments in the eastern part of Europe, and these revolutionary movements were, these grassroots start in the community revolutionary movements were kind of fomenting there and encouraging people to revolt and to seek a better life for themselves. And many people saw that opportunity in America. They saw a more independent life for themselves in America. And so they pursued immigration for that purpose. So the types of immigrants that were coming were much poorer people and often fleeing persecution. Sometimes they're fleeing persecution of some time. Now, some of these immigrants were actually not coming to permanently reside in the United States. Some of them were what's called birds of passage, in that they were coming to work and they were just they were sending money back home to their families with the intent to go back home after they'd earned so much here in the United States. And then let's not forget our Asian American immigrant. Large numbers of immigrants are coming from Asia. The Chinese are one of the first large populations of immigrants to come into the United States from Asia. They come in during the gold rush in 1849, and many of them stay. There are some 30,000 Chinese that come in between the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 and the gold rush in 1849. Once that gold rush kind of dwindles out, many Chinese American laborers will join mining pursuits. Some will help build the Transcontinental Railroad and other rail lines out west. So Chinese immigrants are coming onto the West Coast for the most part, and European immigrants are coming onto, or they're entering into the United States on the East Coast. So European immigrants between 1870 and 1920, about 20 million Europeans arrived in the United States. Remember, between 1870 and 1890, most of them are from Northern and Western Europe. After 1890, they're coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and these are people who are considered, air quote, less desirable immigrants coming in poorer, often fleeing persecution with very little resources on hand, and they're coming for opportunity. The Chinese immigrants we talked about 1849 in the gold rush. By 1851, you have a great deal of Chinese immigrants here in the United States. I think I misspoke earlier and said 30,000. 300,000 Chinese have arrived on the West Coast by 1882. 1882 is a turning point. It kind of like stops immigration of the Chinese with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese help build America. They're some of the largest labor contributors on the rail line to build that western section of the Transcontinental Railroad. That's called the Central Pacific Line. Some of them work in domestic work, many work in farming, and there is a very nativist response to the Chinese immigrant. Their customs are very different. They look different than Western Europeans who were the original American immigrants. They look very different. Their customs are different. They bathe more often. So Congress, under pressure from anti-immigrant groups, will pass the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which stops Chinese immigration. Okay, what about the Japanese and what's their contribution to this age of immigration? So the Japanese government and the Hawaiian nation had created an agreement to allow Japanese to come onto the Hawaiian Islands and work in their fruit agricultural pursuits there. And so there's a lot of planters on the Hawaiian Island, and the Japanese come in to work as agricultural laborers. Well, when the U.S. annexes Hawaii in 1898, we immediately have a population of Japanese immigrants immediately, and that immigration doesn't slow down. The Japanese continue to immigrate into the Hawaiian Islands, and it peaks in 1907. And by 1920, you have more than 200,000 Japanese who live on the West Coast. So a great deal of Japanese immigrants. Well, with the high population of Japanese Americans on the West Coast, there's some pressure to limit Japanese influence. And so what happens in San Francisco is unique. They start to put in place some segregation laws. Okay, we're talking about Jim Crow era here. So in San Francisco, they put in place some laws that require the separate educating facilities, separate schools for Japanese children. And so the government of Japan gets involved, and they start to advocate for immigrants that have left Japan and come into the United States. And so there's a gentleman agreement signed. Teddy Roosevelt kind of spearheads this. He's president at the time. And Japan agrees to send less unskilled laborers to the United States and more skilled laborers in exchange for revoking those segregation laws. So we have a peaceful solution there. Okay, I want you guys to read the question answer it. You're going to see this question again. Pause the screen, pause the video, and then start it back up after you've selected the writing. Okay, the agreement that limited Japanese immigration to the U.S., you should have selected the gentleman's agreement that limited the number of unskilled Japanese immigrants coming into the U.S. The Chinese Exclusion Act just banned Chinese immigration, and then C and D are not remotely correct. Okay, so from the West Indies and Mexico, why are people coming, and to where are they coming in the United States? Between 1880 and 1920, 260,000 immigrants arrived to eastern and southeastern United States from the West Indies. So people are coming from Cuba into Florida. They're coming from Jamaica and Puerto Rico to New York and into Florida. So East Coast and the Southeast. They're coming for job opportunities by and large. The Industrial Revolution in the United States has made job opportunities and higher wages comparatively around the world an attraction for immigrants all over. And then in Mexico, we see some 7% of Mexico's population immigrates into the United States during the years of Mexico's political turmoil starting in 1910 and the passage of the Reclamation Act. The Reclamation Act allows irrigation systems to be put in place in arid and dry places out in the West, and so this brings in Mexican laborers working in farming in the American Southwest. So 7% of Mexico's population, we're talking about 700,000 Mexicans, come into the United States in the early part of the 20th century. Okay, so what's life like for these new immigrants? It takes about a week to cross the Atlantic Ocean from Europe, and it takes almost 3 weeks to cross the Pacific Ocean in a steamship to get from Asia to the West Coast. So the passage is long. Most people coming into the U.S. at the turn of the century are coming in the cheapest fashion possible. They're transported in the steerage, in the lower section of steamships that's reserved for cargo. Very little ventilation. They're not allowed on deck. They're relieving themselves in buckets, and some of them are already sick, and the sanitation conditions are poor. Few people die on the passage. Not an overwhelming majority of people die on the passage, but there are some people that die. So it's crowded and unsanitary in the transit. So leaving their homeland and coming into the U.S. is not easy. So destinations, where are these immigration stations located? So people coming from Europe are often processed through Ellis Island. Today we call it Ellis Island. Back then it was called Castle Garden. That was the immigration station in New York Harbor, where the Statue of Liberty is erected there. And for many people, it was a moment of relief and great pleasure to come through New York Harbor there and see the Statue of Liberty. If you are not familiar with Emma Lazarus's poem that's inscribed on the Statue of Liberty, it's something to become familiar with. Bring us your tired, huddled masses yearning to be free. The process in Castle Gardens or Ellis Island was, fairly arduous. You had to pass a mental inspection, like a mental examination. You would pass a physical examination. Really the only reason you would be deported and sent away was if you had like tuberculosis or some contagious disease, but you usually stayed several hours or overnight in the checkpoint. So you had to pass a mental evaluation. You had to prove that you were not a criminal. You'd never been convicted of a felony. And by the early 1900s, you had to have some money. By 1909, you had to have at least $25. So less than 2% of people through Ellis Island were turned away. Physical examination by a doctor, you were questioned by an inspection officer, you had to prove that you weren't a criminal. Now, Over on the West Coast, it was a lot harder to pass inspection, and the Asian immigrants were detained in Angel Island a lot longer. They sometimes stayed a week, and then they were some of them were still deported. Had to pass inspection, prove you weren't a criminal, had at least $25. Between 1892 and 1924, 17 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island. Here's an image of Castle Garden in New York Harbor, Ellis Island, and